My name is Mara Dunn. And last Christmas I learned a hard truth. Cruelty hides best behind good manners. We were late to my son David's dinner. Crawling through traffic while my husband James flexed his scarred hand on the wheel. When we parked, the windows glowed like a stage already set. I told myself to smile and be grateful we'd made it. On the porch, a cracked window carried Ashley's voice into the cold. People lose their appetite looking at those horrible marks, she said. As if my husband were a stain she could scrub away. James went still beside me. My finger found the doorbell and didn't press. I spent years in hospitals and know when pain turns to resolve. James swallowed, squared his shoulders, and I set my hand on his arm. We would walk in with dignity or not at all. I chose dignity for both of us. Headlights washed the porch as a silver sedan slid into the driveway. Ashley's parents stepped out. Coats neat, faces composed. 12 years. And we had never met them. That was Ashley's choice, not ours. The man Robert Mitchell looked unshakable until he saw James. Color left his face in a rush. His eyes fixed on the burns that climb from James's hand to his neck. He reached for the railing. Patricia asked what was wrong. But he didn't answer. He stared at my husband as if a ghost had stepped into daylight. His mouth worked once, twice. Then he whispered, "I know those scars." The words frosted the air. The front door opened, and Ashley's smile died when she saw us together. We hadn't rung the bell. We hadn't moved. In the next 20 minutes, everything we thought we were as a family would split down the grain that night. Inside the house, warmth and candlelight wrapped around the tension like ribbon around a bruise. David hurried from the kitchen, still wearing an apron that said, "Grill Master," his face lighting up with relief. For a moment, I thought we might still salvage the evening. Then Robert Mitchell followed us in. His eyes locked on my husband as if the room held only them. The sound of laughter from the dining room faltered when Robert spoke. He asked James where he'd gotten his scars, and his voice trembled on the edge of recognition. James hesitated, then said quietly, "A fire. A long time ago." Robert's reply sliced through the murmured conversation. Was it Philadelphia? August 1970. The silence that followed felt endless. James went pale, and I saw his throat move as he swallowed the past back down. When Robert whispered, "You pulled me out," the room spun. Ashley's smile vanished, her perfect hostess mask cracking wide open. David stared at her, confusion giving way to realization. His wife's face was frozen, but guilt flickered behind her eyes. I saw her calculating how much we had heard. What could still be denied? It was too late. Robert's tears and James's stunned silence told the truth louder than any accusation. Dinner turned into an autopsy of memory. Robert explained how a teenage boy had carried him from a burning building before disappearing into the night. James listened, hands trembling, the old scars seeming to burn fresh under the chandelier's light. Ashley kept glancing toward the door, like a trapped animal searching for an exit. He felt anger rise beneath my calm. The way heat builds before a storm, 12 years of Ashley's polished disdain suddenly made sense. She hadn't just disliked my husband, she'd been hiding something monumental. Something that could have changed everything between our families. When the plates went untouched, and the children's laughter drifted faintly from the kitchen, I knew the first wound had been struck. It wasn't Robert's revelation that hurt the most, it was the knowledge that Ashley had buried this truth for years, choosing shame over humanity. The dinner that began with cruelty ended with exposure, and there was no stitching the evening or our family back together again. In the days after Christmas, our house was too quiet. James buried himself in his workshop. sanding a bookshelf that didn't need to exist. While I replayed every word Ashley had said that night, David called often, torn between disbelief and guilt, trying to convince himself it was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew the truth was uglier than any accident of words. I reached out to Patricia Mitchell, unsure whether she would even take my call. To my surprise, she sounded relieved, almost expectant, as if she'd been waiting for me. We spoke like two women forced to clean up after a storm neither of us created. By the end of that conversation, the foundation of Ashley's lies began to show its cracks. Patricia confessed that Ashley had been obsessed with family history for years. She had recorded interviews with her parents, traced their ancestry, and dug through old archives. 3 years earlier, Robert had told her about the fire, describing how it changed his life and how he'd never found the boy who saved him. Patricia suspected Ashley had connected the dots the moment she met James. A week later, an envelope arrived at my office, Patricia's handwriting, neat and deliberate. Inside were printed emails, screenshots, and notes from Ashley's computer. I spread them across my desk and felt the air leave the room. She had hired a private investigator 2 years ago, confirmed James's identity, and then paid the man to keep silent. Each document revealed a careful strategy. Ashley had treated our family like a public relations crisis to manage. One file was even labeled the Dunn problem, outlining her plan in numbered phases. Phase 1, create emotional distance. Phase 2, control family gatherings. Phase 3, reframe James as unstable. The precision of it made my skin crawl. I realized then that Ashley hadn't acted out of insecurity, she'd acted with purpose. She saw my husband's scars not as tragedy but as leverage. A story that threatened her curated image. The kind of woman who could hide a man's heroism to protect her social standing was far more dangerous than I'd imagined. That night, I sat alone with her. Words spread before me like evidence of a crime. Ashley called them phases. I called them what they truly were: beautiful lies polished to perfection, ready to ruin anyone who got in her way. 2 weeks passed before Ashley made her move. I should have known she wouldn't stay silent for long. Women like her never do. Her cruelty came disguised as elegance, her vengeance wrapped in sympathy. The morning it happened, I was at the hospital, halfway through reviewing volunteer schedules, when my phone began to vibrate non-stop. By noon, my inbox was drowning in messages from friends and colleagues. A headline sat at the top of my feed: "A daughter-in-law speaks out about family secrets." The post was public, written by Ashley Dunn, complete with a soft-lit family photo. In it, she described her husband's broken family, her addict father-in-law, and the enabling wife who hides behind charity work. Every word was laced with poison, but phrased like a cry for help. She wrote that she'd tried to protect her children from a volatile man with a hidden past, and that I'd covered for him for decades. Her tone was apologetic, mournful even, as if she were the victim of our existence. I'd seen manipulative people before, but never someone who could twist compassion into a weapon so precisely. Within hours, her post exploded across social media. People I barely knew were sharing it with captions like, "Stay strong. Ashley and no one should hide behind family shame." The comment sections filled with strangers judging us, dissecting our lives as if they'd lived them. It was astonishing how quickly empathy could turn into entertainment. By the evening, I was summoned to the hospital board. They didn't accuse me of anything, but their questions carried doubt. How much of this was true? "Mrs. Dunn, why didn't you disclose your husband's history of addiction?" I told them the truth, that it was 45 years in the past, that James had been sober longer than some of those board members had been alive. But truth travels slower than gossip. James didn't speak when I showed him the post. He just sat in his chair, reading it again and again, the screen reflecting in his eyes like firelight. That night, he deleted his social media accounts and said nothing at all. Silence had always been his armor. But now it felt like surrender. I couldn't let that happen. 2 days later, Robert Mitchell called. His voice was steady, but I heard the anger beneath it. The kind that comes from betrayal twice over. He said he was holding a press conference. He was going to tell the world who James really was, the boy who'd run into a burning building to save him. He would set the record straight. When Robert stood before the cameras, gray-haired and dignified, and called my husband a hero, the tide began to turn. He spoke of gratitude, of truth buried under vanity, and of a man who had never once sought recognition. By the next morning, headlines had changed. Ashley's post was no longer a confession, it was a scandal. Her image of control was cracking, and she had no idea that her next act of vengeance would be the one to destroy her completely. Ashley's silence after Robert's press conference lasted only a week. Then came the letter from her attorney. Crisp and cruel, accusing James of being a psychological risk to his grandchildren. She wanted full custody of Emma and Tyler, claiming exposure to their grandfather could cause them emotional harm. It wasn't just revenge anymore, it was annihilation disguised as maternal concern. David was devastated. I could hear the exhaustion in his voice when he said he never thought she'd go this far. He had believed the press would humble her, that public shame would force her to reflect. But Ashley didn't know remorse. She only knew control. And she was willing to weaponize the law to keep it. The hearing was scheduled for early spring. I remember the courthouse smell old paper and nerves. James sat beside me in his best suit, his scars visible, refusing to hide anymore. He said he didn't want to fight. But I reminded him that surrendering would let Ashley turn his silence into guilt. Her attorney painted James as unstable, a man with a volatile past and latent trauma. They called his heroism reckless, saying he'd run into danger with no regard for consequence. The irony made my stomach twist. A life saved had become their evidence of instability. Ashley sat in perfect stillness, hands folded like a saint on trial. Then David's lawyer rose. She presented 45 years of sobriety records, letters from the AA community, and testimony from Carl, James's sponsor. Robert took the stand next, recounting the fire, his rescue, and how James's courage had shaped his life. His voice shook but never wavered. He ended by saying, "If this man isn't fit to be a grandfather, then none of us deserve family." David testified last. He spoke simply, with no notes, no theatrics. He said his father had been his moral compass, the man who taught him that integrity mattered most when no one was watching. The judge listened quietly, her pen unmoving. For a moment, I believed we might actually win. After a long recess, the judge returned with her ruling. She denied Ashley's petition, declaring James no threat to anyone and chastising her for manipulating her children. The words washed over us like sunlight breaking through smoke. We'd won the case. But when I looked at Ashley's cold expression, I knew something darker was still waiting. For a few brief weeks, it felt like peace might finally return. The court ruling had stripped Ashley of her victory, and the truth stood in the open for everyone to see. But beneath her calm, public silence, something unhinged was moving. When David called one morning with his voice shaking, I knew exactly whose peace had shattered. He said, Ashley was gone. She'd taken Emma and Tyler from her sister's house and vanished without a trace. Their phones were disconnected, and her lawyer claimed ignorance. The police classified it as custodial interference, but a mother's instinct told me it was far worse than that. Patricia called the same evening, her voice trembling as she described what she'd found while searching Ashley's old room. It was a notebook, filled with dates, plans, and chilling intentions notes about vanishing, about starting over somewhere. No one would find her. At the top of one page, Ashley had written, "They took my image, I'll take their legacy." It read like a manifesto. The next day, Patricia remembered a property in Montana, a secluded cabin the Mitchells once used for summer retreats. David forwarded the address to the authorities, and within hours, police in the area located it. The cabin showed signs of recent use food in the fridge, children's clothes on the beds, but they were gone. On the kitchen counter lay a note addressed to Robert. "You turned the world against me." It said, "Now you'll never see your grandchildren again." The words were cold, deliberate, and final. Robert's voice broke when he read it aloud to us over the phone. In that moment, we all understood the same terrible truth. Ashley hadn't lost the war. She'd only changed the battlefield. Ashley's arrest made national news. The story of a mother who kidnapped her children after losing custody captured every headline. When the trial began 8 months later, the courtroom was crowded with reporters, their cameras waiting for another headline to feed on. James didn't want to go, but Robert asked him to, and some debts between men can't be refused. The prosecution's case was solid. They presented the journal Patricia had found, Ashley's emails, and testimony from Dr. Shen, the child psychologist who'd helped rescue Emma and Tyler. David sat at the front, his shoulders squared but his eyes tired, watching the woman he once loved as if she were a stranger. Ashley, immaculata as ever, wore pale blue, the color of innocence, and looked directly at the jury with practiced vulnerability. Her lawyer was smooth, the kind who turned shame into sympathy. He argued that Ashley hadn't kidnapped her children. She had protected them from a family that had emotionally abused her. He painted her as a desperate mother, gaslighted by a manipulative husband and in-laws who wanted to control her. It was a performance. But even I had to admit, it was a convincing one. Then came the defense's surprise move. They called me to testify. The lawyer's questions were polite but cutting, probing old wounds. He brought up James's past, his addiction, his hospital records from 45 years ago. He said Ashley had feared a relapse and merely acted out of concern. I answered calmly, but every word felt like walking barefoot over glass. When the prosecution presented Ashley's journal, the room grew quiet. Her handwriting was unmistakable. In one entry, she had written, "If I can't erase their presence, I'll rewrite their story." The jurors shifted uneasily. Ashley didn't flinch. She sat there, chin high, the embodiment of pride refusing to bleed. Robert testified last. He told the story one final time: the fire, the rescue, the 55 years of searching. His voice broke when he said that the man his daughter had tried to destroy was the one who'd saved his life. Then he looked straight at Ashley and said, "You spent your life building a perfect image, but all I ever wanted was to see you be decent." When the verdict came, it was swift. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, interference, fraud. Ashley didn't cry or plead. She simply turned toward us. Her expression, unreadable, and for the first time in a year, I saw her without a mask. It wasn't rage or regret. It was emptiness, the face of a woman who had built her entire world on lies and finally watched it collapse. The courtroom was hushed when the judge read the sentence. Ashley Dunn, 7 years in state prison, permanent loss of custody, and supervised visitation only after her release. She stood motionless as the bailiff approached, her posture straight, her eyes cold. It was pride, not courage, that kept her steady. Before they took her away, the judge allowed her to speak. Ashley's voice was calm, almost eerily composed, as she declared she had no regrets. She said she'd only tried to protect her children from a family that worshipped a scarred man with a past. When she turned toward James, her lips curved into a bitter smile, and she said, "You should have stayed in that fire." The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Robert's face went white, and David buried his head in his hands. But James only looked at her with quiet mercy, his voice soft enough to break hearts. "I lived," he said, "long enough to watch you burn your own life down." There was nothing triumphant about the moment, but there was peace, the kind that comes after years of surviving storms. Ashley's exit wasn't dramatic. She walked out in handcuffs, still convinced she was right, leaving behind a silence that felt cleaner than applause. Justice had arrived, not as vengeance, but as truth finally spoken aloud. And sometimes, that's the only kind that lasts. 6 months later, Christmas came again. The snow was heavy that year, but the house was full of warmth. David hosted, determined to rebuild what Ashley had broken. And for the first time in years, laughter came easily. Robert and Patricia arrived with gifts. Emma and Tyler raced through the halls, and James sat at the head of the table, where he'd always belonged. He didn't wear long sleeves anymore. His scars caught the soft light. No longer something to hide, but something that told a story. Emma stood up before dinner, clutching her juice glass like it was fine crystal, and said, "To Grandpa James, the bravest man I know." Everyone raised their glasses, and James smiled a quiet, peaceful smile that reached all the way to his eyes. As I watched him, I realized what true justice looks like. It isn't the sound of a gavel or the fall of a sentence. It's the sight of a man reclaiming his life, surrounded by love that never left him. His scars were never the tragedy Ashley tried to make them. They were proof he had survived fire, and somehow had learned to shine through it. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it struck a chord or reminded you of your own battles, share your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. Don't forget to subscribe for more true-to-life stories of justice, strength, and redemption. Until next time, take care of your peace.